The fluorescent lights hummed above me, cold and relentless, as I watched my parents walk down that hospital corridor for the last time. My mother's heels clicked against the linoleum floor with a rhythm that seemed too casual, too final. My father didn't look back. Not once. I was 7 years old, burning with fever, struggling to breathe through pneumonia that had filled my lungs like cement, and they simply left. No goodbye kiss. No promise to return. Just the receding sound of footsteps and the automatic doors whooshing shut behind them, sealing me into a world where I would learn that blood means nothing when weighed against inconvenience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. On my bedside table, they left a note written on hospital stationery. We can't do this anymore. You'll be better off here. That was 22 years ago. And I've spent every single one of those years building a life from the ruins they left behind. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and this is the story of how the people who abandoned me in my darkest hour came crawling back the moment my dying mentor left me everything they never could. A fortune, a legacy, and proof that family is something you choose, not something you're born into. November rain hammered against the windows of Mercy General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, turning the world outside into a watercolor blur of grays and browns. I remember that rain. I remember how it sounded like drumming fingers, impatient and endless, matching the rhythm of the oxygen machine beside my bed. The pneumonia had come fast, turning what my parents initially dismissed as a cold into something that made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. For 3 days I'd been in that hospital room, watching cartoons I couldn't focus on, eating Jell-O that tasted like flavored plastic, and waiting for my parents to stay longer than the mandatory visiting hours required. My father, Robert Mitchell, worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company. He was the kind of man who wore cologne that announced his presence before he entered a room, who laughed too loud at his own jokes, and who treated fatherhood like an obligation he'd inherited rather than a role he'd chosen. My mother, Patricia, spent her days at the country club, playing tennis with women who measured their worth in the size of their diamond rings and the prestige of their children's accomplishments. I was neither an accomplishment nor prestigious. I was 7, skinny, bookish, and according to the fragments of arguments I'd overheard through thin walls at home, I was the anchor dragging down their plans for a fresh start. That November afternoon, they arrived together during visiting hours, but something felt different. My mother's makeup was perfect, too perfect for someone visiting a sick child. My father kept checking his watch, that gold Rolex he'd bought himself as a promotion gift, the one he polished more carefully than he'd ever touched my hair. They stood at the foot of my bed, not sitting in the chairs that nurses had positioned for family members, maintaining a distance that felt geographical rather than merely physical. Your mother and I have been talking. My father's voice carried the rehearsed quality of a prepared speech. This situation has become unsustainable. You're going to need extended care, possibly weeks, and we have commitments that we simply cannot postpone any longer. I remember staring at him, my 7-year-old brain struggling to translate adult euphemisms into truth. My mother adjusted her purse strap, a nervous gesture that seemed more concerned with the accessory than with me. The doctors here are excellent, my mother said, her voice bright and artificial like a commercial. You'll be in wonderful hands. Much better than we could provide at home. Even through my fever, I understood. Children always understand more than adults give them credit for. They weren't talking about extended hospital stays with them visiting daily. They were talking about something permanent, something that made my chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with pneumonia. Where will you be? I managed to ask, my voice hoarse from coughing and from the tears I was fighting to hold back. We're relocating. My father said it like he was discussing a business transaction. Arizona. New opportunities. A chance to start fresh. And me? The question came out smaller than I intended. You'll be taken care of, my mother said, already turning toward the door. The state has excellent programs for situations like this. Situations like this. That's what I had become. Not their son. Not Daniel. A situation that required management and disposal. My father placed something on the rolling table beside my bed. That note. The one written on hospital letterhead, probably drafted at the nurse's station while I'd been sleeping. Then they left. My mother's heels clicking down that hallway with increasing speed, as if she couldn't escape fast enough. My father's heavy footsteps, steady and unhesitating. The automatic doors opened, swallowed them into the rain-soaked afternoon, and closed with a mechanical hiss that sounded like the universe exhaling. I don't remember crying immediately. Shock has a way of freezing everything, of making the impossible feel like something happening to someone else, some other kid in some other hospital room. I remember reaching for the note with trembling hands, unfolding it, seeing my mother's looping handwriting. "We can't do this anymore. You'll be better off here." 8 words. That's all 22 years of parenting had amounted to. 8 words on stolen hospital stationery. I folded it carefully, something in my child's mind insisting that I needed to preserve it, though I couldn't have explained why. Evidence, maybe. Proof that this had really happened. Or perhaps just something to hold on to in a world that had suddenly become untethered. A nurse found me an hour later, still holding that note, staring at the doorway as if willing them to return and announce it had all been a terrible joke. Her name tag read Sandra, and her face carried the particular kind of sadness that comes from seeing too many versions of the same tragedy. "Honey," she said gently, sitting on the edge of my bed, "where are your parents?" "They left." My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Left to get dinner?" She was trying to give them the benefit of doubt, trying to find an innocent explanation for why a critically ill 7-year-old was alone. "Just left." I handed her the note. I watched her face change as she read it, watched professional composure crack into genuine horror. She stood abruptly, the note clutched in her hand, and I heard her footsteps quickening down the hallway. Voices rose and fell in the distance, urgent and sharp. Within 20 minutes, my room filled with people. Dr. Gerald Townsend, the hospital administrator, a man whose silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of someone perpetually disappointed by humanity. 2 police officers, their radios crackling with distant emergencies. And a woman I hadn't seen before, younger than the others, with kind eyes and a notebook she held like a shield. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the hospital social worker who would become the first person to teach me that sometimes strangers care more than family ever could. They asked questions I couldn't fully answer. Had my parents seemed upset? Had there been arguments? Did I know where they'd gone? I told them about Arizona, about fresh starts, about being a situation that needed resolving. Dr. Vasquez wrote everything down, her pen moving quickly across the page. And when she looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in my parents' eyes in longer than I could remember. I saw someone who was genuinely angry on my behalf. The police tried to locate Robert and Patricia Mitchell. They discovered that my parents had indeed left Portland. Plane tickets to Phoenix purchased 3 weeks earlier. A condo rented in Scottsdale. Job transfers already arranged. This hadn't been an impulsive decision born of stress and fear. This had been planned, calculated, executed with the same efficiency my father brought to his sales presentations. Oregon's Department of Human Services became involved. Terms like abandonment and neglect were used, words that made my situation official and irreversible. A case file was opened. Daniel Mitchell, age 7, abandoned by biological parents during medical crisis. Those words would follow me through foster care, through psychological evaluations, through every form and document that would come to define my childhood. I remained at Mercy General for another 2 weeks while the pneumonia cleared and while the state decided what to do with an abandoned child who had no other family, no safety net, no place that qualified as home. Dr. Vasquez visited me every day. She brought books, the kind with pictures and adventures that let me escape the beeping machines and antiseptic smell of the hospital. She talked to me like I was a person rather than a problem, asking about my favorite subjects in school, about what I wanted to be when I grew up, about the things that mattered before my world had collapsed. I told her I'd wanted to be a veterinarian because I liked animals better than people. She smiled at that, a sad knowing smile, and said that animals were often better judges of character than humans ever were. On my 12th day in the hospital, something unexpected happened. An elderly man appeared in my doorway, leaning on a wooden cane that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark walnut. He was tall, even stooped with age, with white hair swept back from a face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of decades of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He wore a suit, Not the flashy kind my father favored, but something understated and elegant, the kind that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. "Vincent Harper," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I'm a volunteer with the hospital's patient advocacy program. I heard you might appreciate some company." I learned later that Vincent Harper was one of Portland's most successful real estate developers, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, and who spent his retirement giving back to the community that had made his fortune possible. He volunteered at Mercy General 3 days a week, visiting patients who had no visitors, reading to children who had no one to read to them, simply being present for people who'd been forgotten by everyone else. He'd heard about the boy abandoned in room 347, and something about my story had drawn him down that corridor. We played chess that first day. He taught me the moves, patient when I fumbled the pieces, encouraging when I made a good play. We didn't talk about my parents or abandonment or any of the heavy things that adults usually wanted to discuss. We just played chess, and for an hour I forgot that I was a situation that needed resolving. Vincent came back the next day. And the day after that. He brought me a proper chess set, wooden pieces that felt substantial in my hands, so different from the plastic hospital set we'd been using. He told me stories about his life, about building his first property from a loan he'd barely qualified for, about his late wife Margaret who'd believed in him when everyone else had called him a dreamer. He asked me questions about school, about books I'd read, about ideas I had about the world. He listened to my answers like they mattered, like a 7-year-old's opinions on dinosaurs and space exploration were worth his full attention. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, Vincent was there. He stood beside Dr. Vasquez as she explained where I would be going, a temporary foster placement while the state searched for something more permanent. He shook my hand, formal and serious. "You're a bright kid, Daniel. Don't let this define you. Let it refine you." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I nodded anyway, clutching the chess set he'd given me as a parting gift. I thought that would be the end of it, that Vincent Harper would become just another kind face in the parade of people who'd briefly entered and exited my disrupted life. I was wrong. 2 weeks into my foster placement, a modest home in southeast Portland where a tired woman named Mrs. Chan cared for 4 other displaced children, Vincent appeared at the door. He'd arranged with the state to become my official mentor through a program that paired at-risk youth with community volunteers. Every Saturday, he picked me up in his old Mercedes, the interior smelling of leather and the peppermints he kept in the center console, and we spent the day together. Sometimes we went to the zoo. Sometimes we visited his properties, and he explained the business of real estate in terms a child could understand. Sometimes we just sat in coffee shops, him drinking black coffee and me working through hot chocolate, playing chess and talking about everything and nothing. Vincent never tried to replace my parents. He never spoke badly about them, never demanded I call him anything other than Vincent, never pretended our relationship was something it wasn't. But he showed up. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he showed up. When I struggled in school, he hired a tutor. When I needed glasses, he took me to the optometrist. When I wanted to join the middle school debate team but the foster system's budget couldn't cover the fees, he wrote a check without hesitation. He came to every debate tournament, sitting in the audience, always in the 3rd row on the left, nodding when I made a strong argument. I graduated from high school with honors, the first person in any of my foster placements to do so. Vincent was there at the ceremony, sitting beside Dr. Vasquez, who had remained a steady presence throughout my childhood. Mrs. Chan had moved away years earlier, and I'd cycled through 3 more foster homes, each one a temporary station in a journey that never quite felt like it had a destination. But Vincent had been the constant, the North Star that kept me oriented when everything else shifted beneath my feet. At the graduation party he threw for me at his estate in Lake Oswego, a sprawling property overlooking the water with gardens that seemed to belong in a different century, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a full scholarship he'd established in my name at Oregon State University, covering tuition, room, board, and expenses for 4 years. "I can't accept this," I'd told him, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the weight of everything he'd already given me. "You already have." He'd responded, his hand on my shoulder, steady and sure. "Now go make something of it. Make something that matters." I chose social work as my major, a decision that surprised no one who knew my story. Dr. Vasquez had planted that seed years earlier, showing me through her own example that the most profound impact came not from grand gestures but from showing up for people when everyone else had walked away. I wanted to be for other abandoned children what Vincent and Dr. Vasquez had been for me. A lifeline. A reminder that one person's cruelty didn't have to define the rest of the story. College was the first place I truly felt like I belonged somewhere. My roommate Marcus became my closest friend, someone who knew my history and never treated me like I was broken because of it. I met Amber Chun during a study group in my sophomore year. A psychology major with a laugh that seemed to make the world lighter, and a fierce intelligence that challenged me to think deeper about everything. We started dating that spring, a relationship built on long conversations about childhood trauma and resilience, about the way systems failed vulnerable people, about how we both wanted to spend our lives trying to fix what was broken in the world. She never pitted me for my past. She simply accepted it as part of who I was, the same way she accepted that I played chess obsessively, and that I called Vincent every Sunday evening without fail. Vincent's health began declining during my junior year. The man who had seemed ageless, who had climbed stairs at his properties with the energy of someone decades younger, suddenly looked fragile. His doctor diagnosed him with pancreatic cancer, the kind that came with timelines measured in months rather than years. He told me over dinner at his favorite Italian restaurant, the same place we'd celebrated every one of my birthdays since I was 8. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a business deal rather than his own mortality. "I have excellent lawyers and a solid estate plan," he'd said when I started to protest, to say all the things people say when confronted with impending loss. "But I wanted you to hear this from me first. You've been more than a mentee, Daniel. You've been the son I never had the privilege of raising." I spent every weekend of my senior year at Vincent's estate. Amber often came with me, helping where she could, simply being present during the hours when pain medication made Vincent drift in and out of sleep. We played chess when he felt strong enough, though the games grew shorter as his strength faded. He told me stories I'd never heard before, about his childhood during the Depression, about losing Margaret to breast cancer 20 years earlier, about building an empire because he didn't know what else to do with grief. He spoke about regrets, about his estranged daughter Catherine who lived in Boston and hadn't spoken to him in 15 years after a falling out over her marriage to someone Vincent had disapproved of. "Family is complicated," he'd said one afternoon, staring out at the lake. "Sometimes the people we choose matter more than the people we're born to." Vincent Harper died on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks before my college graduation. I was holding his hand when he went, Amber sitting beside me, Marcus Freeman the attorney standing respectfully near the window. Vincent's last words were characteristically practical. "You're going to be fine, Daniel. Better than fine. Make it count." The funeral was held at a historic church in downtown Portland, filled with business associates, former employees and community members whose lives Vincent had touched through his quiet philanthropy. Catherine arrived from Boston, a woman in her 50s with her father's eyes and a hardness around her mouth that spoke of years spent nursing grievances. She didn't acknowledge me during the service, didn't approach me at the reception held afterward at Vincent's estate. Marcus Freeman asked to see me privately the day after the funeral. We met in his downtown office, all dark wood and leather chairs, the kind of space designed to convey authority and permanence. He slid a folder across his desk, thick with legal documents that meant nothing to my grief-clouded mind. "Vincent made some changes to his will 6 months ago," Marcus said gently. "He wanted you to know that everything was done properly, through appropriate legal channels, with full consideration of all potential challenges." I stared at the folder, not understanding why I needed to know about Vincent's will, assuming perhaps he'd left me a small inheritance, maybe enough to help with graduate school. Marcus opened the folder and began walking me through the documents. The estate was valued at approximately $8.3 million. Properties throughout Oregon and Washington, investment portfolios, savings accounts, the Lake Oswego estate itself. Vincent had left specific bequests to various charities, to former employees, to causes he'd supported quietly for decades. To his daughter Catherine he'd left the family home in Boston where she currently lived, fully paid off, and a trust fund of $2 million. And to me, Daniel Mitchell, he'd left everything else. The remaining properties, the investment accounts, the Lake Oswego estate, and the bulk of his liquid assets. Approximately $3.2 million. along with real estate holdings worth another $3 million. I couldn't process what Marcus was telling me. The numbers were too large, too abstract. Vincent had been my mentor, my chosen family, the person who'd shown up when no one else had. But this level of inheritance suggested something more. A faith in me that felt simultaneously honoring and terrifying. Why? It was all I could manage to ask. Marcus handed me a letter. Vincent's distinctive handwriting covering 2 pages of personal stationery. I read it there in that office, tears blurring the words, having to pause repeatedly to collect myself enough to continue. Vincent had written about watching me grow from a traumatized 7-year-old into a young man committed to helping others. He wrote about seeing in me the son he'd never had, about wanting to give me the foundation he wished someone had given him at my age. He acknowledged that the inheritance would be controversial, that Catherine would likely contest it, that people would question his judgment. But he was clear in his reasoning. Catherine had made her choices, had cut him from her life, had built her own success and needed nothing from him beyond what he'd already provided. I, on the other hand, had built something from nothing, had transformed abandonment into purpose, and deserved the chance to make a real difference in the world without being constrained by financial limitations. Use this wisely. Vincent had written near the end of the letter. Not to buy things or impress people, but to build something that matters. Create the programs that should have existed for you. Be the safety net for children who have none. And know that every life you touch with this inheritance is my legacy continuing through you. You were never the situation your parents made you feel like. You were always the solution the world needed. The letter was dated 3 days before he died. Written in a shaking hand that betrayed how much effort the task had cost him. Marcus explained the next steps, the probate process, the timeline for estate settlement. He warned me that Catherine would almost certainly challenge the will, that I should prepare for a legal battle that could stretch for months. He asked if I wanted to consider a settlement, offering Catherine more to avoid litigation. No, I'd said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Vincent made his choice. He knew exactly what he was doing. I won't dishonor that by backing down because it makes someone uncomfortable. Marcus had smiled then, a small satisfied expression. That's exactly what Vincent said you'd say. The news of the inheritance spread quickly through Portland's tight-knit community. The Oregonian ran a story about the prominent developer who'd left his fortune to a former foster child, rather than his biological daughter. Social media picked it up, turning my life into a public narrative I'd never asked to share. Strangers had opinions about whether Vincent had been right or wrong, whether I deserved the inheritance, whether Catherine had been unjustly punished for whatever family disagreement had caused their estrangement. Amber stood beside me through all of it, helping me ignore the comments and speculation, reminding me that Vincent's opinion was the only one that mattered. We graduated together that May, walking across the stage to receive our diplomas while cameras flashed and reporters tried to get statements about the inheritance. I'd wanted the day to be about education, about the achievement of finishing college despite everything, but it had become another chapter in a story I no longer controlled. Catherine filed her legal challenge 3 weeks after the will entered probate. Her attorney, Stuart Brennan, was exactly what you'd expect from someone trying to overturn an inheritance through intimidation. Expensive suit, aggressive tactics, press releases framing Catherine as the victim of her father's declining mental state, and my supposed manipulation. The lawsuit claimed that Vincent had lacked testamentary capacity when he'd revised his will, that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly man, that the inheritance was the result of a vulnerable person being exploited by someone who deliberately cultivated a relationship for financial gain. Reading those accusations felt like being abandoned all over again, like having my entire relationship with Vincent reduced to a calculated scheme. Marcus assured me the claims were baseless, that Vincent had been evaluated by multiple physicians in the months before his death and declared fully competent, that there was extensive documentation of his clear intentions and sound reasoning. But baseless claims could still be effective in the court of public opinion. The depositions began that summer. I sat in conference rooms answering questions designed to make me look opportunistic, to suggest that every chess game, every birthday dinner, every conversation with Vincent had been part of a long manipulation. Stuart Brennan was skilled at taking genuine moments and twisting them into something sinister. So you played chess with Mr. Harper knowing he found the activity enjoyable, and that this would increase his fondness for you? He'd asked during one particularly grueling session. I played chess with Vincent because he was teaching me strategy and patience and how to think 3 moves ahead. I'd answered, refusing to let him reframe our relationship into something transactional. The fact that we both enjoyed it doesn't make it manipulation. It makes it mentorship. Amber and I moved to Bend, Oregon that fall, accepting positions with a nonprofit that worked with foster children aging out of the system. The smaller city felt like a refuge from the Portland media circus, and the work felt like honoring Vincent's memory in the most direct way possible. We rented a small house with a view of the Cascade Mountains, adopted a rescue dog we named Harper, and tried to build a life while the legal battle raged in the background. Marcus called regularly with updates. Catherine was refusing all settlement offers. The case was likely headed to trial. We needed to prepare for the possibility that this could stretch into next year or beyond. I threw myself into work, helping 18-year-olds navigate the impossible transition from state care to independent living, writing grant proposals to fund programs that provided housing support and job training, doing everything I could to create the safety net that hadn't existed for me. The inheritance sat untouched in accounts overseen by Marcus, gathering interest while lawyers argued over whether I deserved it. I didn't spend a single dollar of it, partly because the legal situation made accessing the funds complicated, but mostly because I wanted to prove that my relationship with Vincent had never been about money. I'd loved him when I had nothing. His wealth hadn't changed that. 1 year after Vincent's death, Marcus called with unexpected news. Catherine wanted to meet with me directly, without attorneys present. She'd reached out through back channels, suggesting a conversation that might resolve things without trial. Marcus was skeptical, warning that it could be a strategy to gather information or create some kind of recorded moment that could be used against me. But something in me wanted to hear what she had to say, wanted to understand the woman who'd shared Vincent's blood, but not his final years. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant in Salem that sat halfway between Bend and Portland. Amber insisted on coming with me, sitting at a nearby table while Catherine and I talked, close enough to intervene if needed but far enough to give us privacy. Catherine Harper looked like her father in ways that were almost painful to witness. The same sharp intelligence in her eyes, the same way of sitting perfectly upright, the same habit of touching her coffee cup without actually drinking from it. But where Vincent's presence had been warm and inviting, Catherine radiated controlled anger, the kind that had been refined over years into something cold and precise. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she'd said, her tone formal and distant. "I wanted to speak with you away from the lawyers and their performances." I'd nodded, waiting, letting her set the pace of whatever this conversation was meant to be. "My father was a difficult man," Catherine began, her fingers drumming lightly against the table. "Controlling, judgmental, unable to accept that other people might have different values or priorities. When I married Thomas, my father gave me an ultimatum: end the marriage or lose the relationship. I chose my husband. That was 15 years ago, and in all that time my father never once reached out, never apologized, never acknowledged that he might have been wrong. And now I'm supposed to accept that he left his fortune to someone he knew for barely 20 years while giving me what amounts to pocket change? I understand that you're hurt," I said carefully, meaning it. "Vincent talked about you sometimes. About the estrangement. He regretted how things ended, but he also felt like you'd made your choice and he had to respect it." Catherine's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Respect it? He punished me for it. And then he replaced me with you. A convenient substitute son who showed up at the perfect time to fill the void I'd left." That stung, the implication that I'd been interchangeable, that any abandoned child could have served the same purpose. But I kept my voice level, refusing to match her anger. "I didn't replace you. I was just a kid who needed someone, and Vincent was someone who needed to help. We found each other by accident, not design. If you'd reconciled with him, I would have been happy for both of you. I never asked him to choose between us. But he did choose," Catherine said, leaning forward. "He chose you. Left you millions while giving me the equivalent of a participation trophy. How is that fair?" Fair would have been him dividing everything equally. Fair would have been him acknowledging that I'm his daughter regardless of our disagreements. I'd thought about that question in the months since the will reading, turned it over in my mind during sleepless nights when the weight of the inheritance felt more like burden than blessing. Vincent didn't leave me the money because I deserved it more than you. I'd said finally. He left it because he believed I'd use it the way he wanted it used. To help vulnerable children. To create programs and support systems. To build something that mattered beyond personal wealth. You're successful, established, financially secure. He knew you'd be fine. But he also knew that $3 million in the right hands could change hundreds of lives. So I'm being punished for being successful? Catherine's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. I worked hard, built a career, made a life for myself without his help. And that makes me less deserving? It's not about deserving. I'd answered, frustrated by the framework she kept imposing on the situation. It's about purpose. Vincent saw money as a tool, not a trophy. He was giving me the tools to do the work he believed in. That's different from rewarding one child and punishing another. Catherine had gone quiet then, staring at her untouched coffee. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. He never even met my children. His grandchildren. Because of his pride and his stubbornness. And now they'll grow up knowing their grandfather gave his fortune to a stranger rather than their mother. I'm sorry for that. I'd meant it genuinely. Children shouldn't pay the price for their parents' choices. I know that better than most. We'd sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of complicated grief filling the space between us. Finally, Catherine had gathered her purse, preparing to leave. I'm not dropping the lawsuit, she'd said, but without the earlier venom. My lawyers say we have grounds and I owe it to my family to fight. But I wanted you to know that this isn't personal. You seem like a decent person who got caught up in my father's final act of control. I hope you understand I have to see this through. I do understand. I told her. And I hope you understand why I won't settle. Not because I want to hurt you, but because backing down would dishonor what Vincent trusted me to do. The trial date was set for October, 18 months after Vincent's death. Marcus prepared me for what to expect, the performative nature of courtroom proceedings, the way opposing counsel would try to provoke emotional reactions, the importance of staying calm and consistent regardless of how personal the attacks became. We spent weeks reviewing every interaction I'd had with Vincent, creating a timeline that documented our relationship from that first chess game in the hospital to his final days. Dr. Vasquez agreed to testify about the circumstances of my abandonment and Vincent's early involvement in my life. Mrs. Chun, my first foster parent, flew in from Sacramento to provide context about how unusual and meaningful Vincent's consistency had been. Even my college professors submitted written statements about how Vincent had supported my education while encouraging me to pursue social work rather than more lucrative fields. The prosecution's strategy became clear during opening arguments. Stuart Brennan painted me as a master manipulator who'd identified a lonely, grieving widower and systematically isolated him from his biological family, while positioning myself as the worthy heir. He presented Vincent's estrangement from Catherine as evidence that he was vulnerable to exploitation, someone whose judgment about family relationships couldn't be trusted. He argued that no rational person would leave millions to someone they'd known for 20 years over their own daughter, unless that person had been unduly influenced. The narrative was effective because it played on primal fears about aging parents being taken advantage of by opportunistic outsiders. Several jurors nodded along as Brennan spoke, and I felt the first real flutter of fear that we might actually lose. Marcus countered with a different story. He presented me as a child abandoned during a medical crisis who'd been given a second chance by a man who believed in using wealth to create change. He showed the jury Vincent's meticulous documentation, letters he'd written to his attorney over the years explaining his evolving relationship with me and his reasoned decisions about his estate. He presented medical records proving Vincent's mental competence up until his final week, evaluations from 3 different physicians confirming he understood exactly what he was doing when he revised his will. Most powerfully, he played a video Vincent had recorded 6 months before his death. A sort of ethical will explaining his choices directly to anyone who might question them. In the video, Vincent sat in his study at the Lake Oswego estate, morning light filtering through the windows behind him. He looked frail but absolutely lucid, his voice steady as he spoke directly to the camera. I'm recording this to make my intentions crystal clear to anyone who might later claim I wasn't of sound mind or was being manipulated. My daughter Catherine made her choice 15 years ago, when she prioritized her marriage over our relationship. I respect that choice even though it hurt me deeply. I've provided for her financially, ensuring she'll never face hardship. But the bulk of my estate is going to Daniel Mitchell. Not because he manipulated me or because I'm senile, but because I've watched him transform trauma into purpose, and I believe he'll use these resources to help vulnerable children in ways that honor everything I tried to build during my lifetime. Vincent went on to detail specific conversations we'd had about my career plans, about the programs I wanted to create, about how the inheritance would be structured to ensure it served charitable purposes rather than personal enrichment. He acknowledged that his decision would be controversial, but insisted it reflected his values and his assessment of how his wealth could do the most good. The video lasted 15 minutes, and by the end, several jurors were wiping their eyes. Stuart Brennan tried to have it excluded as prejudicial, but the judge ruled it was directly relevant to the question of Vincent's testamentary capacity and intent. That video became the cornerstone of our defense. Catherine took the stand on the third day of trial. She testified about her childhood, about feeling controlled by a father who demanded perfection and punished anything less. She described the ultimatum he'd given her about Thomas, the years of silence that followed, the birthday cards she'd sent that were returned unopened. Her testimony was effective because it was genuine. Vincent had been difficult, had been unable to bend on the question of her marriage, had allowed pride to destroy their relationship. The jury saw a daughter who'd been hurt by her father's rigidity, and sympathy shifted in her direction. Stuart Brennan used her testimony to paint Vincent as someone whose judgment about family was fundamentally flawed, someone whose final decisions shouldn't be honored, because they reflected the same controlling nature that had destroyed his relationship with his only child. When it was time for cross-examination, Marcus approached Catherine with respect rather than aggression. He asked about her current financial situation, establishing that she owned a successful consulting firm, that her home was worth over $1 million, that she'd built substantial wealth independent of her father. He asked about the $2 million trust fund Vincent had left her, whether that constituted being cut off or being provided for. He asked whether she'd ever attempted reconciliation in the 15 years of estrangement, whether she'd visited when Vincent was diagnosed with cancer, whether she'd attended his funeral to grieve or only to contest his will. Each question chipped away at the narrative of a victimized daughter, replacing it with a more complicated picture of mutual stubbornness and long-term choices. Then Marcus asked the question that shifted everything. Ms. Harper, in the 15 years you didn't speak to your father, did you know he was volunteering at Mercy General Hospital? Catherine hesitated, clearly unsure where the question was leading. No. Did you know he'd become a mentor to foster children through the hospital's advocacy program? No, I didn't. Did you know that he'd established a scholarship fund for at-risk youth? Or that he'd been funding homeless services in Portland? Or that he'd spent his retirement using his wealth to help vulnerable populations? Catherine's face tightened. My father and I weren't speaking. I didn't know the details of his life. Marcus nodded slowly. So for 15 years while you built your own successful life and raised your family, your father built a second act focused on service and philanthropy. He found purpose in helping people who had nothing, who reminded him perhaps of where he'd started. And when he met Daniel, a 7-year-old abandoned in the same hospital where your father volunteered, he saw an opportunity to make a lasting difference in one person's life. That wasn't manipulation, Ms. Harper. That was consistency with the values your father had developed over decades. The courtroom went silent. Catherine's attorney objected, claiming the question was argumentative, but the point had landed with the jury. I took the stand on the 5th day. Stuart Brennan came at me hard. His questions designed to make every interaction with Vincent seem calculated. Why did you continue seeing him after you left the hospital? Because he showed up. I'd answered simply. Because when you're a kid in foster care, people promising to stay in your life is common. People actually doing it is rare. Brennan pulled out records of gifts Vincent had given me over the years. Christmas presents, birthday gifts, the scholarship fund. Wasn't this grooming behavior, he suggested, an older man using gifts to create dependency and obligation? Those gifts meant Vincent remembered me on days when most people forgot I existed. I'd responded, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. He didn't give me things to buy my loyalty. He gave me things because that's what family does. Brennan shifted tactics, focusing on the final months of Vincent's life. You spent considerable time with him during his illness, correct? Yes. More time than in previous years? Yes, because he was dying and I loved him. You were aware he was revising his will during this period? Marcus had told me he'd updated his estate plan, yes. And yet you continued to visit, to provide care, knowing that you stood to inherit substantially? I would have visited if he'd left me nothing. I'd said, my voice breaking slightly. Vincent didn't owe me money. He'd already given me everything that mattered. He'd given me proof that I was worth showing up for. That moment of vulnerability seemed to resonate with the jury in ways that all the documentation and expert testimony hadn't. Marcus followed up during redirect, asking me to describe specific memories with Vincent that had nothing to do with money or gifts. I talked about learning to play chess, about conversations about business ethics, about the time he'd driven 2 hours to watch me compete in a high school debate tournament even though he just had chemotherapy. I described sitting with him during his final days playing our last chess game, which he'd won despite barely being able to move the pieces, about his last words encouraging me to make his legacy count. By the time I stepped down, several jurors were crying openly. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about testamentary capacity, about Vincent's clear mental state and documented intentions. Character witnesses described my relationship with Vincent as genuine and his decision as consistent with his values. The defense presented evidence that Catherine had been offered multiple opportunities to reconcile and had refused them all, that Vincent had tried to reach out 3 times in the final 5 years and been rebuffed each time. Stuart Brennan fought hard, presenting psychologists who testified about the vulnerability of elderly individuals and the potential for undue influence, even in seemingly genuine relationships. But the weight of evidence supported Vincent's version of events rather than Catherine's. Closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon. Stuart Brennan made an emotional appeal about blood ties and family loyalty, about fathers and daughters and the bonds that should transcend disagreements. He painted me as an outsider who'd exploited Vincent's estrangement from his real family, who'd been in the right place at the right time and had taken advantage of a lonely man's need for connection. He urged the jury to restore what he called the natural order, to ensure that Vincent's wealth stayed within his biological family, rather than going to someone who'd known him for barely 2 decades. It was a compelling narrative, one that played on deep cultural beliefs about inheritance and bloodlines. Marcus stood and approached the jury box, his tone measured and respectful. This case, he'd begun, isn't about blood versus choice or families versus outsiders. It's about honoring the clearly expressed wishes of a competent man who spent his final years trying to make his wealth matter in ways that aligned with his values. Vincent Harper didn't accidentally leave his estate to Daniel Mitchell. He deliberately, thoughtfully, and with full legal support chose to invest in a young man he'd watched transform abandonment into purpose. He chose to fund programs that would help vulnerable children, rather than simply passing wealth down a family line. That wasn't manipulation. That was legacy. Marcus walked the jury through Vincent's video testimony again, emphasizing his clear statements and obvious competence. He reviewed the medical evidence, the documentation, the testimony from people who'd witnessed our relationship over 2 decades. He acknowledged that Catherine had been hurt by her estrangement from Vincent, but argued that hurt feelings didn't invalidate a valid will or override a person's right to distribute their estate according to their own priorities. Finally, he addressed the question of fairness head-on. Catherine Harper received $2 million and a valuable property. She's financially secure and successful. But Vincent's remaining wealth, his final $3.2 million, goes toward creating opportunities for children who have nothing. How is that unfair? How is giving resources to the most vulnerable members of our society instead of to people who are already comfortable in injustice worth overturning? The jury deliberated for 2 days. Amber and I waited at our house in Bend, trying to distract ourselves with work and walks with Harper, but the anxiety was overwhelming. Everything hung on 12 strangers' interpretation of a complicated relationship and competing narratives about family, loyalty, and worth. Marcus called Tuesday afternoon. The jury had reached a verdict. We made the 2-hour drive to Portland in silence, Amber holding my hand while I tried to prepare myself for either outcome. The courtroom was packed when we arrived, reporters filling the back rows, Catherine and her family on one side, Dr. Vasquez and my small chosen family on the other. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman who'd been hard to read throughout the trial. We find in favor of the defendant, Daniel Mitchell. The will of Vincent Harper is upheld as valid and enforceable. Catherine's shoulders slumped. Stuart Brennan immediately began conferring with her about appeals. Marcus squeezed my shoulder, professional satisfaction evident in his expression. But I felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a bone-deep sadness that it had come to this, that Vincent's final gift had been tainted by months of accusations and public examination. Amber wrapped her arms around me, and I let myself lean into her, grateful for her steady presence through everything. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. As people filed out of the courtroom, Catherine approached me, her face carefully composed. Her attorney tried to stop her, but she waved him away. "You won," she said, and there was something like resignation in her voice rather than anger. "I hope you use it well." "I hope I do too." I'd answered honestly. Vincent deserved that much. She'd nodded once, then turned and left, her family trailing behind her. I watched her go, wondering if somewhere in an alternate universe there was a version of this story where Vincent and Catherine had reconciled, where I'd still been his mentee but she'd been his daughter again, where his wealth could have been shared without courtrooms and accusations. But that wasn't the universe we lived in. The inheritance was finally released from probate 3 months later. Marcus helped me set up the structure Vincent had outlined, a foundation dedicated to supporting foster children and creating programs for youth aging out of the system. The Lake Oswego estate became a residential program for young adults transitioning from foster care, providing housing and support for up to 12 residents at a time. The investment portfolios were restructured to provide ongoing funding for scholarships, mental health services, and emergency assistance. I took a modest salary to continue my work with the nonprofit in Bend, but the bulk of the inheritance went directly toward the programs Vincent had envisioned. Amber and I got married that spring at a small ceremony overlooking the Deschutes River. Dr. Vasquez officiated, Marcus served as best man, and the residents from the Lake Oswego program attended, young people who were building lives despite circumstances that had tried to destroy them. During the reception, I'd given a toast acknowledging Vincent's absence and presence simultaneously, thanking him for showing me that family was something you built through consistent showing up, rather than something you inherited through accidents of biology. Every person in that room represented someone who'd been shown up for, and that felt like the truest memorial to Vincent I could imagine. News of the trial outcome and the foundation's creation spread through social work and foster care networks. I started receiving calls from other states asking about replicating the model, from former foster youth sharing their stories, from people who wanted to donate or volunteer or simply say that seeing Vincent's legacy honored this way gave them hope. The foundation grew beyond what I'd imagined, expanding to serve 3 counties within the first year. We hired former foster youth as staff members, created peer mentorship programs, established emergency funds for young people facing eviction or medical crises. Every decision was guided by a single question that Vincent had once asked me during a chess game when I was 12 years old, and struggling with a particularly difficult move. What choice would you want someone to make if you were the one who needed help? 2 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter from Catherine. She wrote that she'd been following the foundation's work, that she'd read articles about the programs we'd created and the lives we'd touched. She acknowledged that her father had been right about how I'd used the inheritance, that his trust had been well placed even if that reality was difficult for her to accept. She didn't apologize for the lawsuit, but she did express something like peace with the outcome. Her letter ended with a question. Would I be willing to meet again? Not to discuss the inheritance but to share memories of her father, to help her understand the man he'd become in the years they'd been estranged? I discussed it with Amber, uncertain whether reopening that connection would help or hurt. She'd reminded me that grace wasn't something you extended only to people who'd earned it, that sometimes offering peace to people who'd hurt you was how you kept hurt from defining you. We met at the same restaurant in Salem, the neutral ground where we'd had our first difficult conversation. Catherine looked different, less armored, more willing to be vulnerable. We talked for 3 hours, sharing stories about Vincent that painted a fuller picture of who he'd been. She told me about her childhood, about a father who'd been demanding but also deeply principled, who'd built his business with integrity even when shortcuts would have been easier. I told her about the mentor who'd taught me chess and patience, who'd shown up every Saturday regardless of weather or his own schedule, who'd believed I could build something meaningful from nothing. Our memories didn't contradict each other. They complemented, showing different facets of the same complicated man. Before we parted, Catherine handed me a box. These were in storage at the Boston house. My father's journals from the last 20 years. I thought you should have them. Inside were leather-bound notebooks filled with Vincent's handwriting, documenting his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes for both Catherine and me. I thanked her, genuinely moved by the gesture. We didn't become close after that meeting, but we achieved something more important than closeness. We achieved understanding, a mutual recognition that we both loved the same man in different ways and that his choices, however painful for her, had been made with clear intention and sound mind. She stopped viewing me as the person who'd stolen her inheritance, and I stopped viewing her as the antagonist in my story. We both became what we actually were, two people shaped by the same man's legacy in very different ways. The Foundation's third anniversary celebration was held at the Lake Oswego estate on a warm June evening. The gardens that Vincent had maintained so meticulously had been transformed into gathering spaces where current and former residents mingled with donors, volunteers, and community partners. Amber stood beside me greeting guests, 6 months pregnant with our first child. A daughter we'd already decided to name Margaret after Vincent's late wife. Dr. Vasquez arrived with Marcus, both of them beaming with pride at what had been built from tragedy and trust. The program now served 43 young people across 3 residential sites, had provided scholarships to 18 college students, and had created an emergency fund that had prevented homelessness for over 100 youth in crisis. During the formal program, several residents shared their stories. A young woman named Jessica talked about aging out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go, how the Foundation's housing program had given her stability while she completed her nursing degree. A young man named Derek described being abandoned by his family when he came out as gay at 16, how the Foundation's support had allowed him to finish high school and start college without being forced to choose between authenticity and survival. Each story was a variation on the same theme that had defined my own life. People who'd been discarded by those who should have protected them, finding second chances through the choice of strangers to show up consistently. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the gathered crowd and felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd inherited a fortune I never expected and didn't feel I deserved. That inheritance came with a trial with accusations, with people questioning whether I'd manipulated a dying man for financial gain. Standing here now, seeing the lives changed by Vincent Harper's trust in me, I finally understand what he was doing. He wasn't just leaving me money. He was leaving me proof that one person's belief can become dozens of people's second chances. Every resident in our programs, every scholarship recipient, every young person we've kept from homelessness represents Vincent's legacy continuing through all of us. The applause was warm and genuine, but what moved me most was seeing the residents themselves clapping, young people who understood intimately what it meant to be written off and then chosen, to be told you were worthless and then shown evidence to the contrary. After the formal program ended and guests mingled over catered food and music from a local band, a commotion near the estate's entrance caught my attention. I turned to see 2 people I hadn't laid eyes on in 22 years walking through the garden gate. My parents, Robert and Patricia Mitchell, looked older but essentially unchanged. My father still carried himself with that salesman's confidence. My mother still dressed like she was headed to a country club luncheon. They moved through the crowd as if they belonged there, scanning faces until they spotted me. My body went cold. Amber must have sensed my reaction because she immediately moved closer, her hand finding mine. Dr. Vasquez noticed them too, her expression hardening into something protective. Marcus appeared at my other side, his attorney instincts activated by whatever he read in my posture. My parents approached with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, practiced expressions that probably worked well in their social circles but looked grotesque to someone who knew what lay beneath. "Daniel," my father said, extending his hand as if we were business associates reconnecting at a conference. "You've done well for yourself. We've been reading about your foundation. Very impressive." I didn't take his hand. Instead, I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. My mother jumped in with her own practiced cheerfulness. "We've been living in Scottsdale, but we saw the article in the Oregonian about tonight's celebration. We thought it was time to reconnect to see how you've turned out. Her words were remarkable for what they didn't acknowledge. No mention of the abandonment, the hospital room, the note on stolen stationery. No apology or explanation for 22 years of absence. Just casual reconnection, as if I were a college friend they'd lost touch with rather than the 7-year-old child they'd discarded during a medical crisis. What do you want? My voice came out flat, emotionless. Years of therapy helping me maintain composure when every instinct wanted to scream. My father's smile faltered slightly. We wanted to see you to congratulate you on your success. We heard about the inheritance from that developer, quite a windfall. We thought perhaps we could discuss how we might be involved in your work going forward. There it was, the real reason for their appearance. Not guilt or love or even curiosity about who I'd become. Just the scent of money drawing them back like sharks to blood in the water. Amber squeezed my hand, a silent reminder that I didn't have to engage, that I could ask them to leave and be completely justified. But something in me needed to hear what they'd say, needed to understand what kind of people could abandon their child, and then return 2 decades later with hands extended for a share of someone else's generosity. Involved how? I asked, my tone making clear I already knew the answer. My mother glanced at my father, some unspoken communication passing between them. Well, we are your parents, Daniel. Family should support family. We thought perhaps the foundation could benefit from our experience. Your father has connections in real estate. I have fundraising experience from my charity work in Scottsdale. We could be assets to your organization. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't even pretending this was about relationship or reconciliation. This was a business pitch. A calculated attempt to position themselves as valuable enough to deserve compensation or consideration. I felt Dr. Vasquez move closer, her presence a reminder of who had actually shown up, who had actually been family when it mattered. Let me make sure I understand, I said slowly, my voice carrying enough that people nearby began to notice the conversation. You left me in a hospital when I was 7 years old. Abandoned me during pneumonia that could have killed me. Left a note saying I'd be better off without you. For 22 years you never called, never wrote, never checked whether I was alive or dead. And now, because I inherited money from a man who actually showed up, you want to be involved in how I use it? My father's expression hardened, the salesman mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. You're still angry about that. It's understandable, but you need to understand our position at the time. We were young, overwhelmed, facing financial pressures you couldn't comprehend. We made a difficult choice that we believed was best for everyone. You clearly landed on your feet. No harm done. No harm done. I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. I spent my childhood in foster care. 5 different placements. I learned to keep my belongings in a backpack because I never knew when I'd be moved again. I went to bed hungry more times than I can count. I had nightmares about being abandoned for 15 years. But no harm done, right? Because I survived? My mother tried a different approach, her voice taking on a wounded tone that probably worked well with her Scottsdale friends. We were different people then, Daniel. We've grown, changed. We've regretted our choice every day. That's why we're here now, trying to make amends, trying to be part of your life now that we're in a position to do so. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired its construction. But I'd learned from Vincent how to recognize when people were playing chess while pretending to make casual conversation, how to see 3 moves ahead and understand the real objective. If you regretted it, you would have found me years ago. I said quietly. Oregon's foster care system isn't a secret organization. You could have reached out when I was 8 or 12 or 16. But you didn't, because you didn't actually care what happened to me. You care now only because you read that I have $3.2 million. The crowd around us had gone silent, everyone in earshot now openly watching the confrontation. My father's face flushed red, anger replacing the false friendliness. You ungrateful little bastard. We gave you life. We're your blood. You owe us something for that. And there it was, the real sentiment beneath the pleasantries. Not love or regret or genuine desire for connection. Just the entitled belief that biological relationship created debt, that giving birth was a transaction that demanded repayment regardless of what came after. Marcus stepped forward, his attorney voice cutting through the tension. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Marcus Freeman, Daniel's attorney and executor of the Harper estate. I need to inform you that this event is private property, and you're here without invitation. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." My father ignored Marcus, his attention locked on me. "We've consulted with lawyers, Daniel. Oregon law recognizes parental rights to support from adult children in cases of need. We're prepared to file a claim against your inheritance for financial assistance. After everything we sacrificed raising you for 7 years, the least you owe us is compensation for that investment." The threat hung in the air, crude and desperate. They weren't even pretending this was about relationship anymore. This was pure extraction, an attempt to claim resources they had no moral right to by exploiting whatever legal technicalities they could find. I felt Amber's hand tightening around mine, felt Dr. Vasquez's steadying presence, felt the eyes of every resident and volunteer watching to see how I'd respond to the people who'd first taught me what abandonment felt like. I took a breath, centering myself in the way Vincent had taught me during chess games when the board looked overwhelming. "You want to file a claim? Go ahead," I said calmly. "Marcus, make sure you provide them with the full documentation. The hospital records from 2002 showing they abandoned me during a medical crisis. The note they left, which I still have, stating they couldn't do this anymore. The police reports from the investigation. The DHS files documenting their deliberate abandonment. The testimony from Dr. Vasquez and my foster parents about the impact of that abandonment. And make sure any judge who hears their claim understands that the inheritance they're targeting came from a man who stepped in to do the job they walked away from." My mother's composure cracked, tears forming that might have been genuine or might have been another performance. "You can't understand what it was like for us, the pressure, the fear. We were young, we made a mistake. Everyone deserves forgiveness, Daniel. Everyone deserves a second chance." "You're right," I said, my voice softening slightly, not with forgiveness but with something sadder, something like pity. "Everyone does deserve a second chance. But second chances are earned through changed behavior, through genuine accountability, through proving you've learned from your mistakes. You haven't done any of that. You showed up here tonight not to apologize or make amends but to claim a piece of money you have no right to. That's not seeking forgiveness. That's just continued selfishness with a different script." My father's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We'll see what a judge says about your attitude and your obligations. You think you're better than us now because some old man left you his fortune? You're still the same pathetic kid we left in that hospital, just with better accessories." The words should have hurt, should have hit the wound they were aimed at. But after 22 years of building a life, of being shown what real love looked like by Vincent and Dr. Vasquez and Amber and everyone who'd chosen me, those words had no power. They were just noise from people whose opinions had stopped mattering the moment they walked out of that hospital corridor. Security arrived then, 2 staff members who'd been alerted by the disturbance. Marcus spoke quietly to them, and they approached my parents with professional courtesy but clear intent. "Sir, ma'am, you need to leave the property now. If you refuse, we'll have to contact the police." My parents looked around, perhaps only then realizing how their performance had played to the crowd. No one looked sympathetic to them. The residents knew abandonment when they saw it, recognized the predatory instinct of people who appeared only when there was something to extract. The volunteers and donors understood they were witnessing the exact kind of family failure the foundation existed to address. My parents were outnumbered by people who'd learned through hard experience that biology meant nothing compared to the choice to show up. They left under escort, my father muttering threats about lawyers, my mother crying tears that seemed more about public embarrassment than genuine emotion. The garden gate closed behind them with a final click that felt remarkably similar to the sound of that hospital door 22 years earlier, the sound of people removing themselves from my life by their own choice. The celebration continued after their departure, though the energy had shifted into something more charged, more conscious of the battle lines between biological family and chosen family. Several residents approached me afterward to share their own stories of parents reappearing once success or stability had been achieved, always with hands extended for benefits they'd never invested in earning. Jessica, the nursing student, hugged me and whispered that watching me stand firm against people who'd hurt me gave her courage to maintain boundaries with her own destructive family. Derek told me that my refusal to pretend blood created obligation validated his choice to build family from friends, rather than trying to repair relationships with people who'd rejected his identity. Marcus pulled me aside before he left that evening. they'll follow through on the legal threat. He said without preamble. Oregon does have filial responsibility laws, though they're rarely enforced and there are exceptions for abandonment and abuse. I'll start preparing our defense, but you should know this could get ugly. They'll try to make you look like a vindictive child punishing parents for one mistake. Let them try. I said, surprised by how calm I felt. Vincent will survive a legal challenge from his biological daughter. I'm not afraid of facing down two people whose only claim on me is that they walked away when I needed them most. We have documentation, witnesses, and the truth on our side. That's more than they've ever had. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later. Robert and Patricia Mitchell versus Daniel Mitchell, claiming financial support under Oregon's filial responsibility statutes, and citing their years of parental care before circumstances forced them to make difficult decisions about my placement. The language was carefully crafted to minimize the abandonment, to present it as a thoughtful choice made in my best interest rather than what it actually was, pure selfish convenience. The suit claimed I owed them ongoing support payments of $5,000 monthly, plus retroactive compensation for the 7 years they'd raised me, totaling approximately $420,000. They were literally trying to charge me for their legal obligation to care for a child they'd chosen to have. The case drew media attention immediately, reporters drawn to the narrative of wealthy heir, refusing to support biological parents who'd fallen on hard times. Some coverage was sympathetic to my position, highlighting the abandonment and the opportunistic timing of their claim. Other coverage presented it as a morality tale about ungrateful children and the obligations owed to parents regardless of circumstances. Social media divided into predictable camps, people arguing passionately about filial duty, biological bonds, and whether past abandonment released someone from all future obligations. I stopped reading the comments after seeing dozens of people insist that parents always deserve support, that childhood abandonment was something I should forgive and move past, that withholding money from people in need made me as bad as they were. Amber reminded me that public opinion didn't matter, that the only opinions that counted were the judges and my own conscience. We're raising our daughter to understand that family is about action, not biology. She'd said one night when the stress of the lawsuit was keeping me awake. Your parents are teaching her the same lesson Vincent taught you, just from the opposite direction. They're showing her what not to do, how not to be. That's valuable too, even if it's painful. Our daughter Margaret, called Maggie from birth, arrived 2 weeks before the trial date. Holding her in the hospital, that same hospital where I'd been abandoned 22 years earlier, felt like completing some cosmic circle. I promised her that she'd never question whether she was wanted, never wonder if love had conditions, never feel like she was a burden her parents were looking to escape from. The trial began on a cold January morning, the courtroom feeling too familiar after the battle over Vincent's will. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table looking older than they had at the foundation event, dressed conservatively as if for church, playing the role of struggling elderly parents rather than the middle-aged opportunists they actually were. Their attorney, a different lawyer than Stuart Brennan but employing similar tactics, opened with an emotional appeal about the sacred bond between parents and children, about how society's fabric depended on honoring family obligations, even when relationships were complicated. He presented my parents as people who'd made one difficult decision during overwhelming circumstances, and had spent decades regretting it, people who deserved compassion rather than permanent exile from their son's life. Marcus countered with the facts, the cold documented reality of deliberate abandonment, and 2 decades of chosen absence. He walked the jury through the timeline, the note left in the hospital, the police investigation, the complete lack of contact or concern for 22 years, the sudden reappearance immediately after news of my inheritance became public. He presented expert testimony about the long-term impacts of parental abandonment on child development, the years of therapy I'd required, the trust issues and attachment difficulties that persisted into adulthood. He showed that filial responsibility laws were designed to prevent elderly parents from becoming public charges when their children had means to support them, not to reward parents who'd abdicated their responsibilities and then returned seeking profit. My father testified that they'd been young and frightened, that my medical bills had been overwhelming, that they'd believed placing me in state care would ensure I received better treatment than they could provide. He claimed they'd tried to contact me multiple times over the years, but had been blocked by the foster care system. a lie that was easily disproven by DHS records showing no such attempts. My mother cried on the stand, insisting they'd thought about me every day, that leaving had destroyed her but that they'd believed it was the right choice. Her tears might have been convincing if not for the 22 years of evidence proving she'd been perfectly capable of moving on and building a new life while never once checking whether I'd survived my childhood. When I took the stand, I told the truth plainly and without drama. I described being 7 years old, sick and scared, watching them walk away. I explained what it felt like to grow up knowing the people who created you had found you so burdensome, they'd abandoned you at your most vulnerable. I acknowledged that people make mistakes, that circumstances can be overwhelming, but I noted that mistakes followed by 2 decades of indifference aren't really mistakes anymore. They're choices. Choices that reveal character and priorities. My parents had chosen not to be parents long before they left me in that hospital. The abandonment was just the moment when they finally acted on a choice they'd already made. Their attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, someone using wealth to punish parents for one bad decision. But Marcus had prepared me well. I explained that I'd built a foundation dedicated to helping abandoned children, that I'd devoted my career to creating the support systems I'd needed, that my entire life was oriented around making sure other people didn't experience what I had. That's not vindictiveness, I'd said calmly. That's transformation. I'm not punishing my parents by refusing to reward their abandonment. I'm simply declining to participate in the fiction that giving birth creates an eternal claim on someone's resources, regardless of how you treated them afterward. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat between Amber and Marcus, Maggie sleeping peacefully in Amber's arms, completely unaware that her grandparents were trying to extract money from the father she'd barely met. The jury foreman, an older gentleman who'd listened intently throughout the trial, stood and delivered the verdict with clear conviction. We find in favor of the defendant, Daniel Mitchell. The plaintiff's claim for filial support is denied in its entirety. The courtroom remained quiet, no gasps or dramatic reactions, just a sense of inevitable conclusion finally arriving. My parents sat frozen, my mother's face crumpling while my father stared straight ahead with an expression I couldn't read. Their attorney began whispering urgently, probably already discussing appeal options, but Marcus had warned me this was coming regardless of the outcome. The judge addressed my parents directly before dismissing the court, her tone carrying unmistakable reproach. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, the filial responsibility statute exists to prevent elderly parents from becoming destitute when their children have means to help them. It does not exist to reward parents who voluntarily terminated their parental relationship and then returned seeking financial benefit only after their child achieved success through the efforts of others. Your abandonment of your son during a medical crisis, followed by 22 years of complete absence, demonstrates a level of parental failure that this court cannot and will not reward. Your claim is denied, and I strongly advise against any appeal. No appellate court will view your actions more favorably than this jury has. My parents left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the small crowd of reporters waiting for statements. Marcus handled the press, giving a brief statement about justice being served and the importance of protecting abuse survivors from ongoing exploitation by their abusers. I stood on the courthouse steps with Amber and Maggie, the January wind cutting through my coat, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or vindication, but a quiet settling, like a book closing on a chapter that had been left painfully open for too long. They'd come back into my life trying to take something that wasn't theirs, and the law had confirmed what I'd always known. Biology creates no obligation when it's been backed by decades of abandonment. Dr. Vasquez had attended every day of the trial, and she approached me now with the same steady presence she'd brought to that hospital room 22 years earlier. "You did well in there," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "You told the truth calmly and clearly, and you let the facts speak for themselves. Vincent would have been proud of how you handled this." I appreciated her words, but what struck me most was the realization that I hadn't been fighting for Vincent's approval or anyone else's. I'd been fighting for every child who'd been abandoned, who'd discarded them. I'd been fighting for Maggie so she'd grow up in a world that understood family was about commitment, not just genetics. The media coverage after the trial was extensive but ultimately sympathetic to my position. Several major outlets ran features about parental abandonment, and the complicated question of adult children's obligations to parents who'd failed them. Opinion pieces debated whether filial responsibility laws needed reform to account for childhood abuse and neglect. Foster care advocates used the case to highlight systemic failures that left children vulnerable, and then expected them to somehow emerge as adults with unlimited capacity for forgiveness and financial support. My parents became symbols of something larger than their individual actions, representations of a particular kind of parental selfishness that the culture was slowly beginning to name and reject. 3 weeks after the trial, I received a certified letter from my parents' attorney. They were dropping any plans for appeal and requesting I sign a mutual non-contact agreement. The letter included a pre-drafted document stating that both parties agreed to have no further contact or communication, that all claims between us were resolved, and that neither party would make public statements about the other going forward. It was a surrender dressed in legal language, an acknowledgement that they'd lost completely and wanted to exit with whatever dignity they could salvage. Marcus reviewed the agreement and found it acceptable, noting that it protected me from future harassment while giving them the clean break they were requesting. I signed it without hesitation, adding my signature to a document that formalized what had been true for 22 years. We were not family. We shared DNA but nothing else. No history worth preserving, no relationship worth maintaining, no connection that served anyone's well-being. The notary witnessed my signature, stamped the document official, and just like that it was over. The people who'd given me life had no further claim on the life I'd built from the ashes of their abandonment. Marcus filed the agreement with the court, and I received a copy for my records, placing it in a file with my adoption papers from the foundation and Vincent's final letter. Documents that told the story of how family was made and unmade, how biology mattered less than choice, how showing up consistently was worth more than genetic connection. Spring arrived in Bend with the sudden intensity that characterized high desert seasons, snow melting almost overnight to reveal the brown earth beneath. The foundation's residential programs were operating at full capacity, with waiting lists for services that broke my heart, even as they validated the need for what we'd built. Every young person we couldn't immediately serve represented someone still vulnerable, still at risk of the kind of trajectories that led from childhood trauma to adult crises. We'd helped dozens, but hundreds more needed what we offered. The inheritance that had seemed so vast when Marcus first explained it was being deployed as quickly as we could responsibly manage, and I understood why Vincent had been so specific about wanting the money used for charitable purposes rather than personal enrichment. Amber returned to work part-time after Maggie turned 3 months old, and we developed a rhythm of shared parenting that felt revolutionary compared to how I'd been raised. We attended to Maggie's needs together, split nighttime feedings and diaper changes, made decisions collaboratively rather than one person dictating while the other complied. I was determined that our daughter would see partnership modeled from her earliest days, would understand that caring for children was everyone's responsibility, rather than something delegated to mothers while fathers remained conveniently absent. Every time I changed a diaper or sang Maggie to sleep, I thought about my father checking his Rolex in my hospital room, calculating how quickly he could leave. The Foundation's board meeting that April brought news that required significant decisions. We'd been approached by a coalition of nonprofits in Seattle interested in replicating our model, and we'd received inquiries from foster care agencies in 3 other states asking for technical assistance in developing similar programs. The question was whether we should expand geographically or deepen our work in Oregon. The board was split, some members arguing for maximizing impact through wider reach, others insisting we needed to prove the model's long-term effectiveness before attempting replication. I found myself thinking about Vincent's approach to real estate development, how he'd built slowly and carefully, ensuring each property was sustainable before moving to the next. We decided on a hybrid approach, deepening services in Oregon while creating a consulting arm that could share our model with other organizations. It felt like the choice Vincent would have made. Ambitious but measured, growth-oriented but responsible. We hired 2 new staff members to lead the expansion work, both former foster youth who'd aged out of care and built successful careers despite the obstacles. Their lived experience made them credible messengers, and their success stories provided proof that the trajectory from foster care to stable adulthood was possible with adequate support. One of them, a woman named Tanya who'd experienced 5 placements before aging out at 18, became the Foundation's spokesperson, sharing her story with legislators and funders in ways that made the statistics personal and immediate. Summer brought the Foundation's annual fundraising gala, held again at the Lake Oswego estate under lights strung through the garden. The event had become Portland's premier charity gathering, drawing business leaders and philanthropists who competed to demonstrate their commitment to vulnerable youth. We raised $800,000 that night, money that would fund scholarships and emergency assistance for another year. During my speech thanking donors and volunteers, I spotted Catherine sitting near the back, her presence unexpected but somehow appropriate. She donated quietly to the foundation every year since our reconciliation conversation, never seeking recognition or involvement, just supporting the work her father had made possible. After the formal program ended, Catherine approached me with a woman around my age, introducing her as her daughter Sophie, Vincent's granddaughter. Sophie had her grandfather's sharp eyes and that same quality of focused attention that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She was completing a doctorate in social work at Boston University, studying trauma-informed care models for foster youth. We talked for over an hour about her research, about the Foundation's programs, about the grandfather she'd never met who'd somehow shaped both our lives from beyond the grave. Before she left, Sophie asked if she could spend her summer internship with the Foundation, learning from our programs and contributing her research expertise. I agreed immediately, recognizing the opportunity for Vincent's biological and chosen families to collaborate in service of his legacy. Sophie arrived in June and threw herself into the work with an intensity that reminded me painfully of Vincent. She interviewed residents about their experiences, analyzed our program data, and identified areas where we could strengthen services based on emerging research. She and Amber became close, bonding over their shared interest in developmental psychology and their mutual frustration with systems that failed children then blamed them for the resulting struggles. Watching Sophie play with Maggie one afternoon, I thought about how Vincent would have loved seeing his granddaughter connecting with the great-granddaughter he'd never know existed. Sophie returned to Boston in August with enough data for several academic papers and a commitment to continue consulting with the Foundation. She'd become part of our extended network, one more person choosing to show up consistently rather than merely claiming connection through biology. Her mother Catherine sent a note thanking me for mentoring Sophie and acknowledging that her father's choice to invest in me had created ripples she was only beginning to understand. We're not close and probably never will be, but we've achieved something more valuable than closeness. We've achieved mutual respect and a shared commitment to honoring Vincent's memory through action rather than sentiment. The Foundation's 5th anniversary arrived with surprising speed, time moving in that accelerated way it does when you're fully engaged in meaningful work. We'd now served over 200 young people through our programs, with 93% of residents successfully maintaining housing and employment 1 year after completing services. Our scholarship fund had sent 37 students to college, with 22 already graduated and working in fields from nursing to education to social work. The emergency fund had provided critical assistance to over 300 youth in crisis, preventing evictions, covering medical bills, and providing the kind of immediate help that meant the difference between stability and catastrophe. I was reviewing grant applications in my office when Marcus called with news that sent ice through my veins. "Your father died last night. Heart attack. Your mother is claiming she's destitute and has filed for survivor benefits through Social Security, but she's also indicated she might pursue a wrongful death claim suggesting you contributed to his death through the stress of the lawsuit and your refusal to provide support." I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process feelings I couldn't name. My father was dead, and I felt nothing except concern about being dragged into more legal battles. That absence of grief told me everything about what they destroyed through their choices. The potential relationship that had died in a hospital corridor when I was 7 years old. Marcus assured me that any wrongful death claim would be immediately dismissed, that no court would find liability when the plaintiff had voluntarily created the stressful situation through their own lawsuit. But the threat itself was revealing, showing that even my father's death hadn't ended my mother's attempts to extract resources from me. She'd buried one meal ticket and was immediately looking for another, using grief as a tool rather than experiencing it as an emotion. I told Marcus to monitor the situation but take no action unless she actually filed something. I wouldn't be proactive in reaching out, wouldn't send condolences or acknowledgement. We'd signed a non-contact agreement, and I intended to honor it even if she was looking for reasons to violate it. The wrongful death claim never materialized, whether because my mother's attorney advised her it was baseless, or because she recognized that another public loss would further damage her reputation. But 3 months after my father's death, I received a letter forwarded through Marcus's office, my mother's handwriting on an envelope marked personal and confidential. Marcus had opened it first per our agreement, checking for legal threats or harassment, and found only what appeared to be a genuine letter. He forwarded it with a note saying I should read it but wasn't obligated to respond. The letter sat on my desk for a week before I opened it, the sight of my mother's handwriting still capable of triggering the 7-year-old who'd unfolded her abandonment note. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on plain paper without the performative emotion of her previous communications. She wrote about my father's death, about being alone for the first time in her adult life, about realizing that they'd burned every bridge and destroyed every relationship in pursuit of comfort and convenience. She acknowledged that they'd been wrong to abandon me, wrong to return seeking money, wrong to threaten legal action when I built something meaningful from the ruins of my childhood. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, noting that she understood she'd forfeited any right to either. Instead, she asked a single question. Was I happy? Had I managed to build a life worth living despite what they'd done to me? I showed the letter to Amber that evening after Maggie was asleep, curious about her perspective on whether it represented genuine reflection or just another manipulation. Amber read it twice, her expression thoughtful. I think she's sincere, and I think that almost makes it worse. She finally said. She's realizing too late that she destroyed something irreplaceable, and there's no path back. That's a horror of her own making, but it's still horror. The question is whether you need to respond, whether her realization requires anything from you. I thought about it for several days, drafting responses I never sent, trying to find words that felt true to who I'd become rather than reactive to who she'd helped create. Finally, I wrote a single paragraph on plain paper, no return address or identifying information beyond my signature. Yes, I'm happy. I've built a family that chooses me daily, raised a daughter who'll never question whether she's wanted, and created programs that help children you left behind. None of that happened because of you, and very little of it happened despite you. It mostly happened independently of you, which is exactly what you chose when you walked away. I hope you find peace with your choices, but that peace isn't something I can give you. I signed it, mailed it without ceremony, and felt the door close on something that had been rattling in the back of my mind for 22 years. They were truly gone now, first through choice, then through legal decree, finally through death and acceptance. The Foundation's work continued expanding in ways that surprised even our most optimistic projections. The Seattle replication was succeeding, with 2 residential programs serving 30 youth, and showing outcomes comparable to our Oregon sites. Other states were adapting our model, creating versions that fit their regulatory environments and community needs. We'd become part of a growing movement recognizing that foster youth needed sustained support through their 20s, not just services that ended at 18 when they were least equipped to handle adult responsibilities. Tanya presented our model at a national conference, and the response led to consulting requests from organizations in 15 states. Maggie turned 2 with a birthday party in our backyard, surrounded by residents from the Foundation who'd become her extended family. She called them by name, ran to them for hugs, treated them with the easy affection of someone who'd never learned to fear abandonment. Watching her interact with young people who'd experienced profound rejection, seeing them be gentle with her in ways their own parents never were with them, I understood that healing happened in community rather than isolation. These young people were learning to parent themselves through being present for a child who trusted them, and Maggie was learning that family came in many forms, that love was measured through consistency rather than biology. Dr. Vasquez retired from Mercy General that year, and we hosted a celebration at the Foundation honoring her 40 years of service to vulnerable children. She'd become the Lake Oswego program's volunteer consultant, visiting weekly to provide clinical supervision and support to staff. At her retirement party, resident after resident spoke about how she'd advocated for them, fought for their needs, been the one adult who'd consistently believed them when systems defaulted to disbelief. Her impact was measured not in policies or programs, but in individual lives touched, children who'd been seen and valued when everyone else looked away. She represented what Vincent had shown me, That one person's choice to show up could alter someone's entire trajectory. The Foundation's 8th year brought our most ambitious project yet, a collaboration with Oregon State University to create a scholarship program specifically for former foster youth pursuing social work degrees. The program would provide full tuition, housing stipends, and wraparound support services, ensuring that students wouldn't have to choose between education and survival. We'd fund 10 students per year, creating a pipeline of professionals who understood foster care from lived experience and could transform systems from within. The program was named the Vincent Harper Scholars Initiative, and applications opened to students across the Pacific Northwest. We received over 100 applications for the first cohort, each one a story of resilience and determination that deserved support. Sophie had finished her doctorate and taken a faculty position at Portland State University, moving back to Oregon to be closer to the Foundation and to her mother who'd relocated from Boston the previous year. Catherine had sold the family home and bought a modest condo in Portland's Pearl District, explaining in our occasional emails that she wanted to be part of the community her father had loved, wanted to understand what had drawn him to service work, rather than remaining bitter about his choices. She'd begun volunteering with a literacy program for children in foster care, her way of connecting with the population her father had championed. We had dinner occasionally, awkward at first but gradually becoming more comfortable, two people learning to honor a complicated man through parallel work rather than shared grief. Maggie started preschool that fall, and the transition brought unexpected emotions for both Amber and me. Watching her walk confidently into a classroom, secure in the knowledge that we'd be there for pickup, that home was stable and predictable, highlighted everything that had been absent from my own childhood. I'd never had that confidence, never trusted that adults would follow through on their promises, never relaxed into the security that should have been every child's birthright. But Maggie had it, and that fact represented a generational healing that felt as significant as any program the Foundation had created. I was breaking cycles rather than perpetuating them, giving my daughter what I'd never received and trusting that she'd carry that security forward into her own future relationships. The Foundation's 10th anniversary was celebrated with a gala that drew over 500 attendees and raised $2.3 million in a single evening. We'd grown from a dream in Vincent's estate planning conversations to a thriving organization with multiple sites, partnerships across 4 states, and a reputation for evidence-based practice that attracted national attention. The speech I gave that night focused less on numbers and more on stories, sharing testimonials from residents and alumni about how sustained support had changed their trajectories. I spoke about Vincent, about his belief that wealth was most valuable when invested in human potential, about how one man's choice to mentor a hospitalized child had created ripples that now touched hundreds of lives. Catherine attended with Sophie, and for the first time, I introduced them publicly as Vincent's daughter and granddaughter, family members who contributed to his legacy through their own work and commitment. The audience applauded, recognizing the bridge we'd built between biological and chosen family, the way Vincent's impact transcended the conflict over his estate. After the formal program, Catherine pulled me aside with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for not erasing me from this story," she said quietly. "You would have been justified in doing so after everything. But you've let Sophie and me be part of what he built. And that's a generosity I don't deserve but deeply appreciate. You've earned your place here through showing up." I told her honestly, that's all Vincent ever required of anyone. The following spring brought unexpected news that Vincent's estate had residual assets we'd been unaware of, stocks and bonds held in forgotten accounts that probate hadn't initially captured. Marcus worked with Catherine to claim and distribute these assets according to Vincent's will, which meant the Foundation received an additional $800,000. We used it to establish an endowment, ensuring the organization's sustainability beyond any single donor or funding cycle. The endowment was structured to provide operating support in perpetuity, making the Foundation's existence as permanent as any human institution could be. Vincent's legacy would continue long after everyone who'd known him personally was gone, his values encoded in organizational structure and mission, rather than dependent on memory. Maggie turned 5 that summer, old enough now to understand in simple terms what the Foundation did and why it mattered. We brought her to the Lake Oswego estate for a residence picnic, and she played with teenagers who'd experienced trauma she couldn't imagine, protected by the stability we'd built for her. Watching her laugh with young people who were learning to trust again, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Vincent when I was 8 years old, the one where he'd explained that every person had the capacity to either perpetuate harm or interrupt it. You get to choose which kind of person you become. He'd told me, moving his knight across the chessboard. Being hurt doesn't obligate you to hurt others. It just gives you deeper understanding of why healing matters. That lesson had shaped every choice I'd made since, and it was the lesson I was determined to pass to Maggie. Not that the world was safe or fair, but that she had agency in how she responded to its dangers and injustices, that she could choose connection over isolation, generosity over hoarding, presence over absence. Those choices wouldn't prevent all harm or solve every problem, but they'd create pockets of light in systems designed to extinguish it. The foundation was one such pocket, proof that resources plus intention plus consistency could interrupt trajectories that society had written off as inevitable. Every young person we served represented futures that statistics said were impossible, and their success was the most powerful argument against the cynicism that claimed some children were beyond saving. The 12th anniversary of Vincent's death passed quietly, marked with a small memorial at his gravesite where Amber, Maggie, and I placed flowers beside the headstone. Margaret would have loved seeing this. I told him, speaking to stone that represented but didn't contain the man who'd saved my life. Your money is helping people, your name is on scholarships and programs, but more than that, your values are alive in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. You taught me that one person showing up consistently matters more than 1,000 people making empty promises. I'm trying to show up the way you did, and I hope that's legacy enough. Maggie placed her own flower, a dandelion she'd picked on the walk through the cemetery, and asked if Vincent was my daddy. In a way, I told her. He was the person who taught me how to be your daddy. We drove home through Portland's afternoon traffic, past Mercy General Hospital where everything had begun 27 years earlier, past the courthouse where I'd faced down biological parents and legal challenges, past the downtown office where Marcus still practiced law and occasionally consulted on foundation matters. The city had been the backdrop for every significant moment in my adult life, the place where I'd been abandoned and saved, where I'd learned both the worst and best of what humans were capable of doing to each other. I'd built my life here deliberately, refusing to run from the geography of trauma, instead transforming it into the landscape of healing. Every building held memories, but none of them had power over me anymore. They were just structures in a city where I'd learned to build family from intention rather than inherit it from accident. That evening, after Maggie was asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Amber found me in my study reviewing funding proposals for the next fiscal year. She wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder. "You know what strikes me about your story?" she asked. "How much of it is about people choosing you when they didn't have to? Vincent, Dr. Vasquez, Marcus, even Catherine eventually. They all saw something in you worth investing in, worth showing up for, worth protecting. That's the inheritance that actually matters. Not the money but the proof that you were always worthy of being chosen." I turned to face her, this woman who'd chosen me when she had infinite other options, who'd built a family with me despite knowing all the ways I'd been broken. "I'm glad you chose me too," I said, meaning it with every part of myself that had learned to trust despite overwhelming evidence that trust was dangerous. She smiled and kissed my forehead. "Best choice I ever made. Now come to bed. Tomorrow we have that site visit to the Eugene program, and you need sleep before traveling." I saved the grant documents and followed her to our bedroom, past Maggie's room where our daughter slept peacefully, past the hallway gallery where photographs documented the family we'd created, past the life we'd built deliberately and intentionally from the understanding that nothing was owed, everything was chosen. The foundation's work would continue tomorrow and the day after and the year after, serving children who needed proof that being abandoned didn't determine their worth. But tonight, I was simply Daniel Mitchell, husband and father, someone who transformed the worst moment of his childhood into the organizing principle of his adult life. The 7-year-old boy left in a hospital room with a note from parents who couldn't be bothered to say goodbye had become a man who showed up, who created spaces where showing up was the norm rather than the exception, who proved through daily action that chosen family could be more durable than biological ties. Vincent had given me resources to build that proof at scale, but the lesson itself had come from watching him appear every Saturday regardless of weather or schedule or his own declining health. Consistency was love made visible. And I'd spent my adult life trying to make that love visible for people who'd been told they weren't worth anyone's sustained attention. The story that had started with abandonment had become a story about what happens when someone decides abandonment doesn't get the final word. When trauma becomes teaching rather than imprisonment. When resources meet intention and create transformation. My parents had tried to write me out of their story, had attempted to erase the inconvenience of my existence, but in doing so they'd freed me to write my own story with more intentional authors. Vincent, Dr. Vasquez, Amber, Marcus, even Catherine and Sophie had all picked up pens and added chapters one couldn't have written alone. Together we'd created something that looked like justice, not the punitive kind that required punishment, but the restorative kind that insisted everyone deserved the chance to become more than their worst moments. As I drifted toward sleep that night, I thought about all the children currently in hospitals, in foster placements, in situations where adults had failed them completely. Some of them would find their way to our programs. Others would find different paths to healing. But all of them deserved to know that being abandoned by people who should have protected them didn't determine their value or their future. They deserved Vincent's and Dr. Vasquez's, people who showed up not because they had to but because they chose to, because they understood that one person's consistent presence could interrupt trajectories that seemed predetermined. The foundation would be there for as many as we could reach, proof that other people's failures to love them properly didn't have to define their capacity to build lives worth living. Tomorrow would bring more work, more children needing support, more systems to navigate and transform. But tonight, in a house filled with chosen family and hard-won peace, I simply existed as someone who'd survived abandonment and turned it into a mission statement. My parents had left me with nothing but pain and a note on stolen stationery. Vincent had left me with everything that actually mattered, resources and values, and the unshakable knowledge that I'd been worth his time and attention. The inheritance that had sparked legal battles and public controversy had become the tool for creating futures the world said were impossible. And somewhere, I believed, Vincent was watching the ripples continue expanding, satisfied that his final investment had paid dividends in transformed lives rather than accumulated wealth. That was legacy. That was family. That was justice served not through punishment, but through the radical act of showing up consistently for people everyone else had written off. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.